By the third night of the Ironwood Storm, Willow Bend had disappeared under snow so thick that the horizon no longer existed. Wind screamed across the prairie at nearly 60 miles an hour, and the cold had dropped past 28 below zero. At Hargrove Ranch, one section of the cedar windbreak groaned and gave way. Caleb Marrow tied a length of rope around his own waist and pressed the other end into Eleanor Hargrove's hands. If that wall failed completely, the wind would slam straight into the barn's crooked doorway and seal it shut with drifting snow. Inside, 7-year-old Thomas counted the marker stakes through the whiteout window, his lips moving silently. Baby Faith cried behind the quilted curtain. A pregnant heifer bellowed in the stall, her labor coming too early. And Jesse Colt, the ranch hand who had once laughed at Caleb's work, lay wrapped in blankets beside the stove, too weak to stand. The rope in Eleanor's hands jerked once, hard, and then went still. Only 10 weeks earlier, Caleb Marrow had arrived at this same gate with nothing but a broken-down cart and a single desperate request: a little milk for his children. How it had come to this, that the survival of an entire ranch now depended on whether one exhausted man could keep his footing in the dark. It had been the middle of October 1889 when Caleb Marrow first reached the edge of Willow Bend, Wyoming territory, pulling a handcart with a rope over his shoulder. He was 36, though the road had carved years onto his face that didn't belong there yet. His coat was patched at both elbows with mismatched cloth. In one arm he carried Faith, not yet a year old, wrapped in a shawl that had once belonged to her mother. Beside the cart walked Thomas, quiet and steady, never once asking how much farther they had left to go. Caleb had spent years working the rail camps and cattle stations of the territory, mending fences, repairing pumps, framing barns wherever men needed steady hands. But after his wife Rachel died of fever less than a year after Faith was born, he could no longer travel with the work crews and care for 2 small children at the same time. 3 ranches had already turned him away that autumn. One offered him a bunk, but not his children. Another gave them a single night's shelter before pointing them back to the road. A third told him plainly that the baby would be better off raised by someone else. Caleb had said nothing. He had simply picked up the cart handle and kept walking. On the last evening before they reached Willow Bend, Faith would only settle after thin oat gruel, and Thomas, without a word, tucked half of his portion of bread into the lining of his coat, even after his father promised there would be more food the next day. Caleb saw him do it and understood with a quiet ache that his son no longer believed there would be a tomorrow worth trusting. Then, past a windswept ridge, Hargrove Ranch came into view. The barn's roof sagged on one side, its doors opened straight into the prevailing wind. A row of old cedar trees stood too close to the structure, half of them already dying. Smoke bent sideways from the chimney, but inside the corral, a small herd of dairy cows was still standing, still alive. Eleanor Hargrove, the widow who ran the place alone, stood at the water trough breaking a skin of early ice with the flat of a hammer. It was far too soon in the season for the water to be freezing already. She watched the stranger and his 2 children approach, and before anything else, she asked only one question. "What kind of work do you know?" Caleb didn't offer his story. Barns, pumps, fences, wagon wheels, roofs, hay storage. And what is it you need? His eyes moved to Faith, who had stopped crying only because she was too hungry to keep trying. "Milk for my children? A roof over their heads tonight? I'll fix whatever winter's about to break out here." Eleanor glanced toward her own barn. "What makes you think anything's broken?" Caleb lifted a hand toward the buildings behind her. "Your doors face straight into the northwest wind, your hay's pulling damp from the ground underneath. That water line will freeze solid before the first real freeze even arrives." Silence stretched between them. On the frontier, confidence was cheap, proof was not. Eleanor looked at Thomas, then at the baby resting against Caleb's shoulder. Without answering him at all, she stepped forward and lifted Faith gently into her own arms. "The milk comes first," she said. "Your claims can wait until morning." She led them inside without another question, warmed fresh milk with a little water, tested it against her wrist, and only then nodded for Caleb to begin feeding the baby. A bowl of stew, cornbread, and dried apples was set in front of Thomas. Another waited for Caleb, even after he quietly insisted he wasn't hungry. Thomas ate in silence, and before he finished, he slipped the last piece of bread into his pocket when he thought no one was looking. Eleanor saw. She said nothing. She only set another piece down beside his bowl, as if it had simply always been there. That night, from an old storage loft, Eleanor brought down a half-finished cradle her late husband, Thomas Hargrove, had built years before he died, killed when a timber wagon slid off an icy grade 3 winters past. One rail of the cradle had never been sanded smooth. Caleb noticed she had kept it all this time rather than burn it for kindling. That night, Faith slept peacefully inside it. Thomas fell asleep with his hand still curled protectively around the bread in his pocket. Before sunrise, Caleb was already walking the ranch, not fixing anything yet, only watching. A strip of wool tied near the barn door showed him exactly how the wind curled through the gap. He dug beneath the haystack and found the bottom layer soaked with damp earth. He poured water into the trough and timed how slowly it drained. Inside the house, frost crept along the shrinking gaps between the logs. Eleanor followed a few steps behind, arms folded. When Caleb finally spoke, he pointed rather than explained. "Your barn isn't cold because the walls are thin. It's cold because the wind walks straight through your doors." He knelt by the hay. "This stack is rotting from the bottom." He nodded toward the pump. "That water line sits too shallow. It has nowhere to drain." Finally, he looked toward the row of dying cedar. Those trees were planted to break spring wind. Winter comes from a different direction. The trees stayed the same. The season didn't. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then she pointed toward the tool shed. "1 week," she said. "Then I decide if you see real problems or if you just invent them to earn your keep." Caleb began with the hay, dividing the sour, damp mound into smaller sections raised 8 inches off the ground on old fence rails, leaving air to move between them. Thomas's job was to measure each gap with a stick and count them aloud, the most words he'd spoken since arriving. That afternoon, Agnes Doyle, a widow from a neighboring spread who quietly kept watch over the families of the valley, stopped by with fresh goat's milk and quiet gossip. "Colton Dre's been asking about Eleanor's new man," she said. No one answered. As she set 2 loaves of bread on the table, she noticed the bread still tucked in Thomas's pocket. She glanced at Eleanor. "Should I leave 1 loaf?" Eleanor shook her head. "Leave 2. By the 3rd day, stakes marked the outline of a new windbreak set well back from the barn, angled in an L shape, tall enough to slow the wind without stopping it outright. Caleb and Thomas were driving a post when a rider stopped at the fence. Colton Dre, the largest rancher in the valley and Eleanor's old rival, climbed down without a greeting. Years earlier, he had offered to buy Hargrove Ranch out from under her grief. She had refused, and he had spoken of the place's failure as inevitable ever since. He nudged one of the posts with his boot. "This is Marrow's fence, is it? All this'll do is catch snow and bury your barn." Caleb kept both hands on the post driver. "If I build it too close, you'd be right. And if the distance is wrong, then we'll have failed once cheaply instead of failing once permanently." Dre turned to Eleanor. "Since when does a drifter run your ranch?" "He's not a drifter," Eleanor said, not looking up from the stakes. "He's my foreman until the work proves otherwise." Dre rode off with a warning that winter would decide who was wasting time. Thomas watched him disappear over the ridge, then looked up at his father. "What if he's right?" Caleb reached for the next willow pole. "Then we'll change it before the snow does." The first hard squall tested the wall sooner than expected. Cloth strips tied to the posts showed the truth within minutes. The weave was too tight in the center, and wind rolling over the top slammed back down onto the ground behind it, driving snow toward the very doors it was meant to protect. A panel tore loose, a cow spooked and nearly wrenched a hinge off the gate. Caleb didn't defend the mistake. He cut away a fifth of the willow from the center section. Eleanor watched the fluttering cloth strips. "Weave the next section on a diagonal," she said. "Let the wind spread instead of fighting it head-on." They worked until dark. When the next gust came, it passed through, slowed, and lost its force before it ever reached the barn. "A wall that stops everything just becomes another cliff," Caleb said, watching the cloth dance calmly now. "The wind only needs to lose its strength." That evening, Eleanor handed him the shears. "Your wall," she said. She looked at the swaying strips of cloth. "My wind." Then, just barely, she smiled. "We fixed them both." A week later, Warren Cobb, the county livestock agent, rode out after hearing Eleanor was rebuilding before the season turned. He didn't laugh, only asked hard questions about trapped moisture, about ammonia building in deep bedding, about a canvas curtain too close to a stovepipe. Caleb answered every one honestly, without defending what he didn't yet know. Before leaving, Cobb made one request: keep a ledger. Temperatures, firewood, hay, every time the ice needed breaking, for 3 full weeks. Eleanor hung the ledger by the kitchen door and placed the pencil in Thomas's hand. "Write today's numbers," she said. From that morning forward, facts would speak before anyone's opinion got the chance to. But the cold spoke first. The first batch of chinking between the logs failed within 2 nights, shrinking away and letting the draft back in. Caleb reached for his scraper without a word of complaint. "We start over." Eleanor stopped him. "My father sealed sheep sheds this way. Less clay, more hair, more rye straw. Scratch the first coat before you finish the second." The new mixture held. Later in the loft, Caleb found an old canvas curtain, its stitching still tight. "Rachel made this," he said quietly. "We used it in a work camp once." He began measuring where to cut it to fit between the
rooms. Eleanor told him he didn't have to use it. He did anyway, and as they hung it together, he spoke of his late wife for the first time, how she never feared the cold, only ever checked a child's hands before she checked the fire. Eleanor, in turn, told him her husband used to set 2 tin cups by the stove every morning, without fail. The next morning, 2 cups stood there again. Neither of them explained why. Meanwhile, without ceremony, Eleanor had begun caring for Faith as though it had always been her place too. She learned the difference between a cry for warmth and a cry for hunger. Faith's small fingers began reaching for the collar of her coat. More than once, she fell asleep against Eleanor's shoulder while the ledger still lay open, pencil in hand. One evening, Caleb found them standing that way and reached for the baby. Eleanor only shook her head barely. She just fell asleep. One quiet afternoon, shelling beans, Thomas finally asked her, "Why don't you have children of your own?" Eleanor didn't look up. Some rooms get built and never get filled. Thomas glanced toward the cradle where Faith slept. That one's filled now. She said nothing, but the next morning, Caleb noticed the leftover cornbread sitting untouched on the table. For the first time since his mother died, Thomas had gone to sleep, believing there would still be bread there tomorrow. The first real cold snap dropped the temperature to 11 above sunrise, the first honest test of everything they'd built. The old barn had once struggled to hold above 18 degrees with drafts running the length of the floor. Now, behind the windbreak and the redirected doorway, it held steady near 30. The house burned 5 armloads of wood instead of 7. The bedding stayed dry. Then the water stopped. The buried line held, but the exposed coupling near the trough froze solid, exactly the cold bridge Cobb had warned about. Caleb broke the ice free with an axe, furious with himself. "I missed it." Together, he and Eleanor lowered the valve, boxed the coupling in scrap wood, packed it with dry wool waste, and wrapped it in tarred cloth. They worked past midnight. Eleanor brought out
2 cups of hot chicory coffee. "I said I'd fix this ranch," Caleb said, staring at his cup. "The water still froze." "You promised to fix it," Eleanor said quietly. "You never promised to guess right the first time." The words stayed with him longer than the coffee did. By morning, the water ran and drained itself exactly as intended. For the first time, Caleb understood that Eleanor wasn't measuring him by whether he ever failed, only by whether he stayed until the failure was gone. For 3 weeks, the ledger filled, line by line. Temperature, firewood, hay, milk, every crack of the ice. Nearly 2 fewer armloads of wood burned on the coldest nights. Hay use dropped by 1/5. The trough never froze again. When Cobb returned and read every page, he closed the book and said simply, "I wouldn't call it proven, but it's doing exactly what it should." That same week, Dre rode in again, offering to keep his freight road open through winter only if Eleanor signed over her spring water rights. She refused without hesitation. After he left, Caleb asked only, "How many days of hay if his road stays closed?" 19 by the old count, Eleanor said. "Longer if the ledger's right." Caleb studied the gray sky. "Prepare for 26. Eleanor wrote the number beneath the last entry and drew a single line under it. From that moment, the ranch prepared for the winter they hoped would never come. 3 days before it arrived, the cattle turned their backs to the wind and stopped grazing. The birds vanished. The air went heavy and still. Caleb and Eleanor stopped talking about improvements and started preparing for survival. Marker stakes driven every 20 paces to the barn, the cistern filled, a guide rope strung from house to barn, a repair bag packed and reinforced with a leather strap that had once belonged to Rachel. Thomas watched the last stake disappear into frozen ground. "Why do we need the rope and the posts both?" "A rope keeps a man from drifting," Caleb said, tightening the last knot. "Posts tell him whether he's still going somewhere." Then the Ironwood Storm broke before dawn, exactly from the northwest, exactly as Caleb had said it would. The windbreak bent and held. The barn stayed warm enough. The water kept running. And late on the second day, Caleb followed the line of marker posts into the whiteout and found Jesse Colt half buried in a drift, his horse long gone, his cheeks white with frost, lost from Dre's crew hours earlier. "I saw the cloth," Jesse whispered. "That's why I kept walking." The same windbreak he had once mocked had led him home. On the third night, the heifer went into early labor, the calf turned wrong, and no doctor could reach them through the buried roads. Eleanor worked by lantern light with boiled straps, exactly as she'd once been taught, while Thomas held the light steady, and Caleb rubbed the newborn's ribs with clean straw until, after one unbearable silence, it finally breathed. From the house, Faith began to cry, as if in answer. Later that same night, a section of the windbreak tore loose under the worst of the wind. Caleb crawled post to post in the dark, the rope tied at his waist, until a lattice panel struck him down into the snow and scattered his tools, saved only because Rachel's old leather strap kept the bag from blowing away entirely. Eleanor felt 3 sharp tugs on the rope, their signal, and fed the line out into the storm, until at last it went still and pulled, and Caleb crawled back out of the white on one arm and one knee. "It'll hold till morning," Caleb said. "Morning's enough," Eleanor answered. By the 4th day, the wind had finally broken. No one celebrated. They only began counting. Every animal alive, the newest calf carrying only a small frost-bitten patch on one ear, firewood still stacked by the door, Jesse standing on his own feet again. Caleb walked the ranch with a notebook instead of relief, marking every weakness the storm had found, refusing to let a single flaw hide behind what had survived. When the roads finally opened, people came to Hargrove Ranch for answers instead of rumors. Cobb read every page of the ledger and admitted the water system, the windbreak, the hay crib had each done exactly what they were built to do. Jesse said plainly he'd be dead without those marker posts, and Dre, whose own barn roof had been torn away and whose herd had thinned, offered no apology, only one question. "How far from the barn did you set it?" 30-some feet, then we adjusted for the ground, and you never weave it tight enough to stop the wind completely. Dre nodded once. "Show me." That evening, Eleanor laid a folded agreement on the desk in the ranch office. A share in the ranch, authority over the water systems and the winter work, and one line set apart from all the rest, that Thomas and Faith would always have a home at Hargrove Ranch, no matter what happened between the two adults who'd built this together. "Why give me part of something that was always yours?" Caleb asked. "I'm not giving you what was mine," Eleanor said. "I'm only naming what you already carried." That night, beside the stove, Caleb looked into his cup and said quietly, "I came here asking for milk. I never meant to owe you a life." "I don't owe you one," Eleanor answered, "but there's one here if you mean to share it." They didn't marry until the following May, once the work of rebuilding was behind them, in a small ceremony witnessed only by Cobb and the local doctor. Dre never came, but a neat bundle of fresh-cut willow stakes left quietly by the fence spoke well enough for him. Weeks later, Thomas looked up from the ledger and asked if he had to call her something new now. "You never have to call me anything you don't truly mean," Eleanor told him. He chose her name at first, until one day, tripping near the marker posts, he called out, "Ma," before catching himself, and she knelt to brush the snow from his hands and pretended not to have heard it at all. That same spring, small, unsteady footsteps carried Faith across the yard toward her, and the word that finally reached the air was simply, "Ma." Winter never showed Willow Bend any mercy that year. It showed none at all. What saved Hargrove Ranch was not luck, and it was not good weather. It was that every weak place had been found and mended before the storm ever arrived to test it, and that two people who each mistaken loneliness for strength finally learned to stop carrying it alone. The real value in a story like this isn't the blizzard, it's the habit underneath it. Naming your weaknesses honestly, fixing them before the crisis arrives, and measuring people not by whether they fail, but by whether they stay long enough to make it right.